the world had already learned to fear war. By the time the Second World War erupted, humanity had entered an era where technology, ambition, and sheer desperation collided on a scale never seen before. Cities burned, nations crumbled, and the sky itself became a battlefield. But behind the strategies that shaped history, there were ideas so strange, so audacious, that they almost defied reason. Ideas that, had they been unleashed, could have changed the face of war in ways few could imagine. War, by nature, pushes men to the edge. It forces them to imagine the impossible, to reach beyond the limits of conventional thinking. And in the laboratories, bunkers, and secret offices of the world's greatest powers, brilliant minds conceived plans that were equal parts genius and madness. Some were technological marvels, others moral abominations, and a few were just utterly bizarre. Consider the very concept of weaponizing animals. On the surface, it sounds like something out of a children's story gone terribly wrong. But for the leaders of World War II, the animal kingdom suddenly became a potential arsenal. Bats, for example, were not just harmless creatures of the night. Scientists discovered that they could carry small incendiary devices attached to their bodies. Imagine thousands of these tiny mammals released over enemy cities, each one seeking out shelter in attics and eaves, igniting fires from within. It was a plan that could turn the natural world into a force of terror, a swarm of living incendiaries quietly descending on an unsuspecting population. And yet, it wasn't only bats that caught the imagination of military strategists. Pigeons, dolphins, even rats were evaluated for their potential to deliver messages or explosives. The line between tactical genius and outright lunacy blurred in laboratories that smelled of chemicals, sweat, and the metallic tang of ambition. Each of these schemes reflected a chilling truth about the war: necessity doesn't just breed invention. It breeds obsession. Then, there were chemical schemes that read like the dark fantasies of a nightmare. Mustard gas, while already known from the previous world conflict, sparked ideas that reached beyond simple deployment. Imagine a plan so twisted that it involved contaminating crops to weaken an enemy population slowly, silently, over time. The notion wasn't just to kill soldiers on the battlefield, but to undermine entire nations from the inside out. The thought of such plans being considered, even briefly, reveals just how far desperation can stretch human morality when survival is on the line. And yet, the war also sparked a fascination with the sky. Rockets, bombs, and planes pushed the boundaries of human capability, and sometimes those boundaries bent in ways that were unusual, to say the least. Consider the notion of a flying aircraft carrier, a massive plane that could launch other planes mid-air, dropping them like metallic birds of prey over enemy territory. The design was complicated, risky, and expensive, but the fact that it reached serious consideration tells us something about the mindset of those who ruled the skies. Why limit yourself to the ordinary when the extraordinary seems just within reach? These plans were not isolated incidents, nor were they products of a single country's imagination. Across continents, war planners toyed with the unthinkable, often inspired by desperation and the need to gain any possible advantage. While many schemes never left the drawing board, the stories of their conception are almost as compelling as the battles themselves. And it wasn't just about raw destruction. Psychological warfare became an entire battlefield of its own, where ideas were measured not just by their ability to kill, but to terrify. The mere thought of cities being set ablaze by flocks of bats or rats carrying explosives could strike fear into the hearts of soldiers and civilians alike. In the theatre of war, fear itself was a weapon, and some of these plans wielded it with precision and imagination that bordered on the insane. As we look back at these schemes, it's easy to dismiss them as the fantasies of overactive minds. But each one arose from a tangible context: nations under siege, technological limitations being pushed, and a relentless drive to win at any cost. These were not idle thoughts. They were considered, studied, and in some cases brought frighteningly close to reality. The boundary between innovation and madness in wartime is thin. One moment, a brilliant idea can seem revolutionary, the next, horrifying. And in the Second World War, that line was crossed repeatedly. WWII from the laboratories in America, where bats were studied under the light of flickering bulbs, to the secret bunkers in Germany, where chemical and biological warfare was dissected with meticulous care. The architects of war reached for extremes that challenge comprehension even today. It's important to remember that behind every bizarre plan, there were real people driven by real fears, making real decisions. These weren't simply abstract ideas. They were proposals that could, and almost did, affect millions of lives. And while some of these plans were ultimately abandoned or deemed impractical, the very fact that they existed shows just how far humanity can stretch in the name of survival, strategy, and sometimes sheer audacity. By examining these plans, we don't just uncover quirky historical anecdotes. We gain insight into the pressures, fears, and ambitions of an era when the world teetered on the brink. We see how imagination, even when applied to violence and destruction, can reach astonishing heights. And we also see the fragility of morality when weighed against national survival. So, as we journey through the strange and unsettling landscape of World War II's almost used plans, prepare to be both amazed and unsettled. From incendiary bats to towering airborne fortresses, these ideas represent a side of the war rarely discussed, a shadow world where logic and lunacy intertwined. The question is not just what was possible, but what could have been unleashed, had fate, or reason, not intervened. In the end, these bizarre plans are more than historical curiosities. They are mirrors reflecting the extremes of human ingenuity and the depths of desperation. They remind us that, in war, the line between genius and madness is often invisible, and that the world's most dangerous ideas are sometimes the ones closest to reality. And now, as we step into the stories themselves, prepare to witness the 7 strangest schemes ever conceived in World War II. Schemes so audacious, so extraordinary, that they almost became a part of history and yet, thankfully, did not. The first plan takes us high into the night sky, where the Allies imagined a weapon unlike anything ever deployed. They called it the Bat Bomb. At first glance, it sounds almost comical, an army of bats carrying tiny incendiary devices. But the design was meticulous. Scientists discovered that certain species of bats hibernated in tight spaces. The idea was to release thousands of them over Japanese cities under the cover of darkness. Each bat, instinctively seeking shelter, would nestle into the attics, eaves, and rafters of wooden buildings. Then, a timed incendiary would ignite, setting entire neighborhoods ablaze. The plan was tested in the deserts of New Mexico, and the results were both promising and terrifying. Thousands of bats would indeed disperse, clinging to buildings and igniting fires with devastating potential. Yet, The project was abandoned before deployment, partly because of logistical challenges, and partly because, well, controlling a flock of bats is easier said than done. Imagine thousands of panicked animals, scattering unpredictably, sometimes even turning against the handlers. It was a weapon of chaos, unpredictable and wild. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German scientists toyed with their own peculiar ideas. Hitler's fascination with wonder weapons was notorious, but one of the more obscure projects involved something even stranger than rockets. They experimented with a proposal to create massive waves of freezing fog over enemy cities. The concept was deceptively simple. Release a chemical compound into the atmosphere that would condense and freeze, smothering entire populations and halting transportation. The plan never reached operational stages, but the thought of a city buried in unnatural fog, its streets paralyzed, conjures an eerie picture of terror engineered by science. It wasn't just destruction for the sake of destruction. It was disruption on a scale that could strangle a nation without a single bomb dropping. Then there was the story of the exploding rats. At first, it sounds like a tale told around campfires, but it was very real. British intelligence considered using rat carcasses filled with explosives, smuggling them into enemy facilities. The rats would be placed in coal piles or warehouses, and when thrown into furnaces, the heat would trigger the explosive. The Germans would unknowingly incinerate the rat along with everything around it. It was a plan that relied entirely on subterfuge and timing, a deadly game of patience. In testing, it worked, but the British ultimately decided the risks outweighed the potential. Still, the idea of weaponizing rodents speaks volumes about the creativity and desperation of wartime planners. Not all strange plans were about animals or chemicals. Some reached into the very realm of mechanical absurdity. The Nazis, always dreaming of overwhelming technological superiority, designed a massive rolling fortress called the Landcruiser P. 1000 Ratti. Picture a tank larger than most buildings, bristling with guns, and weighing over 1,000 tons. It would move across battlefields like a mountain of steel, impervious to conventional artillery. Engineers drew elaborate schematics, estimating the power requirements and the sheer firepower it would bring. But the project never left the blueprint stage. The logistics alone, building bridges strong enough to hold it, transporting it, fueling it, made the dream impossible. And yet, the very conception of such a machine reflects a mindset that believed sheer scale could overcome any obstacle. It was audacious, impractical, and horrifying all at once. Back in America, chemical warfare experiments took a darker turn. Scientists explored the use of anthrax spores as a weapon. Entire crops could be contaminated, livestock killed, populations weakened without a single direct attack. The ethical lines blurred completely. Anthrax tests were conducted on isolated islands, targeting livestock and even monkeys to gauge effectiveness. The prospect of deploying such a weapon was terrifying, but the program was never fully realized. The knowledge, however, lingered, proof that some planners were willing to contemplate slow, silent devastation as a tool of war. Diving, then came the plan that seems ripped from the pages of a spy novel. The British, and later the Americans, explored the possibility of using sea creatures, dolphins and sea lions trained to sabotage enemy ships. Dolphins could carry explosives to enemy hulls, while sea lions were trained to place tools on underwater structures. The projects were rooted in serious military research. They were tested in controlled environments, and the intelligence agencies involved believed that, if perfected, these animals could silently disable key naval assets. It was clever, innovative, and undeniably strange. A world where intelligence didn't just reside in humans, but in the animal kingdom as well. Finally, there was the almost surreal audacity of the flying aircraft carrier concept. Massive planes were designed to carry smaller fighter aircraft in their bellies, releasing them mid-flight to strike distant targets. The idea was that these airborne giants could transport, launch, and recover aircraft without needing airstrips, making them mobile fortresses in the sky. Testing proved it was possible in limited form, but the sheer complexity, cost, and risk of catastrophic failure made the concept largely theoretical. Still, for a brief moment, engineers and strategists imagined a sky dominated by these floating arsenals, projecting power in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. What ties these ideas together is a strange combination of ambition, desperation, and the human imagination pushed to its limits. In quieter times, these plans might have been laughed at, dismissed as folly. But in the crucible of World War II, when nations were fighting for survival, they became serious considerations. Every plan, no matter how bizarre, reflected a core principle of war: seek an advantage wherever possible, even if the path there defies logic. As we move deeper into the story, the horror and absurdity of these plans become intertwined. They were conceived by brilliant minds, but also by men under immense pressure, driven by fear, ideology, and the relentless march of history. Each one carried the potential for devastation unlike anything seen before, a reminder that in war, the line between ingenuity and insanity is almost invisible. The world we know today is largely built on the lessons of that conflict. Many of these bizarre plans never saw the light of day, sparing millions from unimaginable fates. And yet, understanding them gives us a glimpse into the extremes of human creativity and the darker corners of our capacity for destruction. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far would any of us go if survival, power, or ideology demanded it? And how close did history come to being shaped by ideas that seemed more like nightmares than strategy? From bats to giant rolling tanks, from rats to chemical clouds, the Second World War was not only a conflict of armies, but a battlefield of imagination. In this theatre, every bizarre plan tells a story, not just of war, but of humanity itself. By the time the war reached its final years, the world had already witnessed destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Cities flattened, millions dead, and entire nations left in ruins. And yet, behind the headlines, behind the battles and the bombings, the most extraordinary and unsettling plans often never left the shadows. Plans that, if realized, could have rewritten the very nature of warfare. Imagine for a moment the night sky above a Japanese city. Thousands of bats, each carrying a tiny explosive, taking flight. The idea was terrifyingly simple in theory, yet impossible to fully control. Soldiers had trained these creatures, tested their behavior, and yet the chaos they could unleash was unpredictable. A single misstep, a premature detonation, a bat flying in the wrong direction, could turn the weapon inward. It was the ultimate gamble, a reminder that in war, even genius can be dangerous when paired with the untamable forces of nature. The project was eventually shelved, but it remains one of the most vivid examples of how desperation can blur the line between strategy and madness. Across the ocean, the explosive rats never reached German furnaces, yet the very idea reveals the ingenuity and dark humor of wartime planning. It wasn't just about disruption, it was about subterfuge, deception, and the art of striking where the enemy least expected it. In a sense, these plans were psychological weapons as much as physical ones, planting fear and uncertainty in the minds of soldiers and civilians alike. War, in these instances, became an arena not just of bullets and bombs, but of ideas. Wild, audacious, and sometimes horrifying. The chemical schemes, from anthrax experiments to fog-inducing compounds, remind us that not all weapons leave immediate marks. Some are invisible, insidious, and terrifyingly patient. They exploit the very elements of life itself, air, water, crops, and weaponize them against human populations. The ethics of such plans are nearly impossible to reconcile. Yet, in the context of a global conflict, where survival was measured in national terms, these ideas were treated with a clinical seriousness. They were studied, refined, and, thankfully, mostly abandoned before they could be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Even the mechanical marvels, like the rolling fortress Rattay or the airborne aircraft carriers, reflect a different kind of human audacity, the belief that technology could conquer all obstacles. Engineers poured hours, expertise, and imagination into these designs, envisioning a battlefield dominated not just by men, but by machines so massive, so formidable, that they would render conventional forces obsolete. The Rattay never moved beyond paper, the flying carriers never soared in combat, yet their existence reminds us of the limitless ambition of wartime engineering. In these designs, the mind reaches for the impossible, driven by the fear that anything less would mean defeat. The animal-based operations. Dolphins trained to sabotage ships, sea lions used as underwater agents, blend science and imagination in ways almost fantastical. They speak to a world in which conventional methods sometimes seemed inadequate, and in which every possible avenue, natural or artificial, was explored. These were not toys, they were instruments of war, honed with meticulous care. And yet, the image of a dolphin, swimming silently under enemy hulls, carrying explosives, feels almost surreal, a testament to the strange creativity war can inspire. As we look back at these 7 plans, the bats, the rats, the chemical schemes, the massive machines, the flying carriers, the fog, and the aquatic operatives, we see a war that was fought not only in trenches and skies, but in laboratories and design rooms. A war where imagination became a weapon, where morality and madness danced on a knife's edge. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is not that these plans existed, but that they almost worked. They were feasible, in their own dark ways, and had circumstances been different, had luck or resources shifted, history might have been rewritten in fire, fog and steel. But they did not succeed. Most were abandoned, some were impractical, and others were simply too terrifying even to attempt. The world survived, scarred and battered, yet spared the consequences of these audacious experiments, and, in that survival, we find both relief and a profound lesson. War pushes humanity to extremes, and the line between genius and insanity is dangerously thin. These plans are a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the darkness inherent in human ingenuity. In the end, the story of these bizarre WWII plans is not just a tale of military history. It is a story about the human mind under pressure, about creativity and desperation intertwining in ways both fascinating and unsettling. It is about the audacity to dream, even when those dreams hover on the brink of nightmare. It reminds us that history is not only written in the battles we know, but also in the ideas that were nearly unleashed, the paths that were almost taken. And perhaps that is the most chilling lesson of all. For every bat bomb that never soared, every rat that never exploded, every chemical cloud that never fell, the potential existed. The war might have ended differently, the world might have been unrecognizable. The mere possibility of these plans forces us to confront the fragility of peace and the terrifying creativity of human conflict. As we close this chapter of history, we are left with wonder, disbelief, and a subtle unease. The Second World War was not just fought in the streets and skies. It was fought in the minds of men who imagined the unthinkable, who took ordinary creatures and ordinary machines and transformed them into instruments of war. And though the world survived their experiments, the stories remain. Reminders of the extremes to which humanity can go when faced with fear, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of victory. History, in this light, is more than dates and battles. It is the sum of what was done, and what was almost done. It is the shadow of ideas that hovered just out of reach, frightening in their potential, fascinating in their audacity. And as we remember these bizarre plans, we confront a truth that is as timeless as it is unsettling in war. The imagination can be as deadly as any weapon, and the strangest ideas may be the ones closest to becoming reality. The world we know today, scarred but standing, owes much to those decisions not taken, to the madness contained, and to the plans that, thankfully, never left the page. And yet, the echoes of these ideas linger, whispering to us across decades. In the crucible of conflict, human ingenuity knows no bounds, and history is shaped not only by what happens, but by what nearly happens.